Have you ever felt like God has forgotten about you? Maybe you've prayed earnestly, seeking answers, and yet it seems like your prayers hit the ceiling and fall right back down. You've asked for direction, for help, for relief, but it feels as though you're in a vast desert with no sign of God's presence. You wonder, oh, why am I still waiting? And does God even see me? These are thoughts that can creep into our hearts during our darkest seasons, when the world seems overwhelming and our hopes seem to fade. But what if I told you that in those moments of feeling forgotten, you are actually closer to God's grace than you could ever imagine? There's an undeniable truth that many of us struggle with in our faith journey. The feeling that God has somehow overlooked us or doesn't care about our struggles. The circumstances we face often create this illusion that God is distant, unresponsive, or even indifferent to our pain. However, let me assure you that nothing could be further from the truth. When you feel forgotten, it is precisely the time when God is preparing to show you something extraordinary, something deeper than you could have ever imagined in your life. God is not absent in your waiting. He is present in it, teaching you, shaping you, and preparing you for a breakthrough you may not yet fully understand. Consider this: God's silence is not his absence. It is in these moments of quiet waiting that God is often doing his most significant work in our lives. You might feel like you're on the sidelines watching everyone else receive answers and breakthroughs. But remember this: God's timing is not like ours. His ways are not our ways. While we may feel forgotten, God is always at work behind the scenes, orchestrating things in our favor, aligning the universe in ways that will benefit his will for our lives. Think of the story of Joseph in the Bible. Joseph was a man who was deeply loved by his father, but rejected and betrayed by his own brothers. He was sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison, all seemingly without reason. The story of Joseph is one of immense pain, yet through it we see a divine purpose unfold that no one could have predicted. God's silence during Joseph's darkest moments didn't mean that he was not there. In fact, God was working out his plan even when Joseph couldn't see it. And he is doing the same in your life right now. You may be in the midst of a season where it feels like you're sinking into hopelessness. The bills keep piling up, relationships are strained, and your dreams seem to be slipping further away. But listen closely, God has not forgotten you. The waiting period you're enduring is not a punishment. It's part of his perfect process to shape you into the person he created you to be. God is preparing you for something greater than you can even comprehend. And this process requires patience, trust, and a willingness to let go of control. There's a powerful moment in the life of David that perfectly captures this idea. David was anointed as king when he was just a young shepherd boy. But it wasn't until many years later, after experiencing immense trials, that he stepped into his role as king. During those years of waiting, David could have easily given up on the promise God had spoken over his life. He could have abandoned his faith when he was pursued by Saul, rejected by his own people, and forced to live as an outlaw. But instead, David chose to trust in God's timing, and in the end, God fulfilled his promise in a way that no one, not even David himself, could have imagined. This is where the breakthrough lies. The waiting doesn't make sense to us because we're trapped in our own limited perspective. But when we trust that God is in control and that his timing is perfect, we begin to see things shift. You might not understand why you're in the situation you're in right now, but I encourage you to hold on to the hope that God has a plan. Just as he used the wilderness in David's life to shape him into the leader he needed to be, he is using your waiting to refine you, to strengthen your faith, and to prepare you for something that will bring glory to his name. One of the most powerful truths to hold on to in these times of waiting is that God's love for you is unshakable. Your circumstances do not define his love for you. Just because things aren't going the way you expected or hoped doesn't mean that God is punishing you or turning his back on you. His love is consistent, faithful, and everlasting. He knows the desires of your heart, and he is working all things together for your good, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment. When you feel forgotten, remember that God is with you even when he seems silent. His silence is not a sign of neglect. It's an invitation to deepen your trust in him. This waiting period is where God often does his most profound work in our lives, transforming our hearts, strengthening our faith and preparing us for the purposes He has set before us. Don't give up in the silence. Your breakthrough is closer than you think. As you continue on this journey, know that you are not alone. God has not forgotten you. He is with you, and He is working everything out according to His perfect plan. Your moment of breakthrough will come, and it will come at the right time. Keep trusting, keep praying, and keep believing that God is faithful, even in the silence. The best is yet to come, and God is using this season to bring about something far greater than you could ever imagine. When you feel forgotten by God, the world around you seems to grow more confusing and overwhelming with each passing day. It feels as if everyone around you is moving forward, experiencing blessings and breakthroughs while you remain stuck, your prayers unanswered, and your heart heavy. But in these moments when it feels like God is distant, something miraculous is happening beneath the surface. The truth is, God is not absent. He is preparing you for something far greater than you can see right now. The silence you experience is not a sign of neglect, but a sign of God's patience and care for you. He's not ignoring you. He's shaping you. We live in a world that thrives on instant gratification. Everything is expected to happen quickly. Answers, results, breakthroughs. Our culture tells us that we should always be moving, always making progress, always reaching the next milestone. But in the kingdom of God, things often work differently. Sometimes, God's most profound work is done in the quiet and the waiting. When you feel forgotten, it may be because God is preparing you for something that requires your full readiness, something that can only be revealed when you are fully prepared to handle it. Take, for example, the story of Moses. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness, tending sheep away from the people he once led, away from the position he once had. He likely thought that his life had reached its limit, that the calling God had placed on his heart had passed him by. But God was using those years of solitude and waiting to prepare Moses. He was refining Moses' character, teaching him humility, patience, and dependence on God alone. Moses couldn't see it at the time, but God was working behind the scenes, preparing him to be the leader who would lead the Israelites out of Egypt. It wasn't in the moments of action that Moses was most prepared. It was in the silent, seemingly insignificant moments when he was alone with God. And in those times of quiet, Moses was shaped into the leader he needed to be. It's the same with you. The times when you feel forgotten are often the times when God is doing His most important work in you. The silence isn't abandonment. It's an opportunity for you to rest in His presence and allow Him to mold you into the person you need to be to receive the blessing He's preparing for you. You may not see it now, but God is using every moment of waiting to make you stronger, wiser, and more equipped to step into the future He has planned for you. But waiting is not easy. It's uncomfortable, and it can stir up feelings of doubt and frustration. You may begin to wonder if God really has a plan for you, or if you're just stuck in a never-ending cycle of disappointment. However, when those feelings arise, remember that God's timing is perfect. He knows exactly when you are ready for what He has for you. His silence is not punishment. It's preparation. You see, God never wastes a season. He never lets a moment go by without using it for your growth, your strengthening, and your transformation. So when you feel forgotten, take heart. Trust that God is actively working in your life, even when you don't see the results yet. Consider the life of Job, a man who, despite being faithful and righteous, experienced extreme suffering. He lost everything, his wealth, his health, and his family. For what seemed like an eternity, Job wrestled with pain, confusion, and the silence of God. But through it all, Job didn't give up on God. He didn't abandon his faith, even when he couldn't understand why he was suffering. Job's story is a powerful reminder that God is still present, even when it seems like He's silent. In the end, God restored Job's fortunes and blessed him with even more than he had before. But this restoration came only after a long period of testing, waiting, and refining. God used Job's suffering to deepen his faith and to prepare him for the blessings that were to come. Job learned through his silence that God is sovereign, that His ways are higher than ours, and that even in the most difficult moments, God is working things out for our good. God's silence is not His absence. It's His way of preparing us for what's to come. It's during these times of waiting that we learn to trust in Him more fully, to rely on His promises, and to develop a deeper relationship with Him. This can be incredibly difficult when we're in the midst of our own struggles. When you're facing a season of silence and feeling forgotten by God, it can be easy to slip into self-pity or doubt. It's natural to want immediate answers, to wish for a clear sign of God's presence. But the Bible teaches us to have faith in the waiting, to trust that God is working even when we can't see it. In Hebrews 11, we read about the great heroes of faith who trusted God through impossible circumstances. They didn't always receive immediate answers, and they didn't always see the results of their faith during their lifetimes. But they trusted that God had a purpose for their lives, even when the outcome wasn't clear. They didn't give up, and neither should you. In those quiet moments, God is asking you to trust in His plan, even when you don't fully understand it. He is teaching you patience, endurance, and faithfulness. Just as He used the silence in Moses and Job's lives to prepare them for greater things, He is using the silence in your life to prepare you as well. Don't give up when it feels like you're not moving forward. Don't give up when it seems like God isn't listening. He is listening, and He is working in ways you can't yet see. In the silence, God is laying the foundation for something incredible, something beyond your comprehension. So hold on, keep trusting, keep praying, keep believing. Even when you feel forgotten, know that you are not alone. God is with you, and He is preparing you for the breakthrough that is coming. Your waiting is not in vain. It is part of the divine process that will bring about something more beautiful than you could have ever imagined. The best is yet to come, and your moment of breakthrough is closer than you think. There are times in our lives when we feel as though the heavens have grown silent, when the very God who promised never to leave us or forsake us seems far away. When we pray, it feels as though our words are falling on deaf ears. And when we look around, we see no immediate sign of God's presence or movement in our lives. In these moments, it is easy to believe that we are forgotten, to think that God is distant, or perhaps even that He has abandoned us altogether. But if you are in a season of silence, I want to remind you that God is not ignoring you. He is not punishing you. He is preparing you for something far greater than you can imagine. When we face hardship, unanswered prayers, or periods of waiting, we often forget that God's silence is not an indication of His absence or indifference. In fact, silence can be one of the most profound ways God works in our lives. It is in these moments of quiet that God can accomplish some of His most important work in us. Silence is not a sign that God has forgotten you. It's often a sign that He's doing something far deeper than you can comprehend in that moment. Think about how silence functions in the process of growth. In nature, a seed does not grow into a mighty tree overnight. It must go through a process of hidden growth beneath the surface of the soil where no one can see. The seed has to undergo a period of transformation where the root system is established and the plant is being strengthened in ways that are not visible to the naked eye. But when the time is right, the plant begins to emerge from the soil, showing the fruits of all the quiet work that has been done beneath the surface. The same is true in our spiritual lives. God often works beneath the surface, in the hidden places of our hearts, when we cannot see what He is doing. Okay, sir. The silence you are experiencing is not wasted time. It is a time of preparation. God is preparing your character, building your faith, and creating a foundation that will support the blessings and breakthroughs He has for you in the future. Just because you can't see it yet doesn't mean that God isn't at work. He is constantly working behind the scenes, preparing you for something incredible. There is a powerful story in the Bible that illustrates this principle. It's the story of Joseph, who experienced many years of hardship, suffering, and seeming abandonment. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit, and thrown into prison. For years, Joseph's life seemed to be marked by betrayal, injustice, and silence from God. Yet throughout this time, God was quietly preparing Joseph for the incredible purpose He had for his life. In the midst of Joseph's pain and loneliness, God was shaping his character, developing his leadership abilities, and refining his faith. Joseph could not see it at the time, but God was orchestrating every step of his journey. The silent years in prison were not wasted years. They were years of preparation. And when the time was right, God elevated Joseph to a position of great power in Egypt. allowing him to save not only his family, but an entire nation from famine. If Joseph had not gone through the silence and the preparation, he would not have been ready for the great purpose that God had for him. The silence was not a punishment. It was a process of transformation. In the same way, God is using the silence in your life to prepare you for what lies ahead. When you feel forgotten or abandoned, remember that God is never far from you. He is intimately involved in your life, shaping you and preparing you for the plans He has set in motion. Your waiting is not a waste. It's a time of growth, strengthening, and spiritual development. God's silence is not a sign of His neglect, but a sign of His care. Just as a master craftsman works in secret to form a beautiful masterpiece, God is working in the hidden places of your life to shape you into the person He wants you to be. Another example of God working in silence can be found in the story of David. David was anointed as king at a young age, but he spent many years in the wilderness, running for his life from King Saul. During this time, David faced immense hardship and persecution, and yet God was refining him for the kingship. In the silence of his years in hiding, David learned to rely on God completely. He was not yet ready to reign. He needed to develop the humility, wisdom, and faithfulness that would allow him to be a great leader. The silence in David's life was not a sign that God had forgotten him, but a sign that God was preparing him for the incredible calling on his life. You may be going through your own wilderness right now. You may be facing silence, unanswered prayers, and a sense of abandonment. But I want to remind you today that God is with you in the silence. He is working in ways you cannot yet see. The quiet moments of your life are not wasted. They are the building blocks of the incredible future that God has prepared for you. Trust that God is using every moment, every experience, every challenge to prepare you for the breakthrough that is coming. In the end, God's silence is not something to fear, but something to embrace. It's in the silence that we learn to trust Him more deeply, to rely on His timing, and to grow in our faith. The quiet moments are not the end. They are the beginning of something new, something powerful, something that only God can do in our lives. So when you feel forgotten by God, remember that He is not silent because He has abandoned you. He is silent because He is preparing you for the incredible plans He has for you. Trust in His timing, trust in His ways, and know that the silence will one day give way to the glorious breakthrough that He has promised. There's something incredibly powerful about the way God works in silence, something we may not fully understand when we're in the midst of it. But as we step back and reflect, we begin to realize that silence is not a sign of God's absence or disinterest. It's a signal of His involvement in a way that goes beyond our understanding. It's during those quiet moments that God is most active in shaping our hearts, our minds, and our lives for the future He has designed. When we're in the thick of it, feeling as though we've been forgotten, we often forget that there is an unseen work happening behind the scenes, work that is so much deeper than we can fathom. Take, for example, the way God operates in nature. A seed planted in the ground does not burst forth from the earth immediately. It lies hidden, buried, waiting for the right conditions to germinate and grow. The soil holds the seed in a kind of a silence as it quietly nurtures and nourishes it, protecting it from the harsh elements until it is ready to sprout. No one can see what's happening beneath the surface, but the seed is being prepared for growth, for life, and for the manifestation of the plant that is to come. And when that plant finally breaks through the soil, it is stronger, healthier, and capable of withstanding the challenges ahead. This same principle applies to our spiritual growth. When we face periods of silence, it's often in those quiet moments that God is doing His deepest work in us. We may not see it, and we may not feel it, but the invisible work is happening. The Bible tells us in Isaiah 55:8, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord." God's perspective is infinitely broader and more eternal than ours. He sees the bigger picture, and His purpose in silence is not always for our immediate comfort, but for our long-term benefit. His work is being done even when we cannot see it. Sometimes we become frustrated because we want answers now. We want God to speak immediately, to show us a sign, or to deliver the blessing that we've been waiting for. But God's timing is always perfect. The waiting, the silence, and the longing are not wasted. They are the very means by which He prepares us for something greater. God knows the exact moment when we will be ready for what He has in store for us. And sometimes, that means we have to endure periods of uncertainty and waiting before the breakthrough happens. If we look to the example of Job, we see how God used a period of intense silence and suffering to prepare him for a greater purpose. Job was a righteous man who experienced unimaginable loss. He lost his wealth, his health, and his family. But in the midst of his suffering, Job didn't receive immediate answers from God. Instead, he cried out in desperation, asking why he was suffering and feeling as though God had turned his back on him. For a long time, there was no answer. God remained silent. But that silence was not God's rejection of Job. It was the time needed to refine his faith. Through Job's suffering, God was stripping away the things that Job had relied on, the comforts and securities that had made him feel safe. God was preparing Job to understand that his true strength and hope lay not in his possessions or his health, but in his relationship with God. And when God finally spoke, it was with such profound wisdom that Job's eyes were opened to the greatness of God's purpose. God restored Job's fortunes, but more importantly, He gave Job a deeper understanding of His nature, His sovereignty, and His plan for Job's life. The silence that Job experienced was not in vain. It was God's way of preparing him for something far greater. God's silence in our lives often works in much the same way. When we feel abandoned, it's easy to think that God has forgotten us, but He is at work in ways that we cannot always understand. The silence allows us to grow in trust and dependence on Him. It teaches us patience and perseverance, and it molds our character so that when God does answer, we are ready for the blessing that He has prepared for us. The silence is a test of our faith, a time where we must learn to trust even when we can't see the outcome, and even when everything around us feels uncertain. In the silence, God is not punishing us. He is preparing us. He is allowing us to walk through the fire of affliction so that we can come out stronger, more refined, and more ready to embrace the good things that He has planned for us. This preparation process is necessary because we can't always handle the fullness of God's blessings until we've been prepared. If we received everything we prayed for right away, we might not have the character or the wisdom to handle it. God's silence is a kind of training ground where He is teaching us to rely on Him, to trust in His timing, and to learn the art of waiting patiently. Moreover, silence often brings us to a place of deeper intimacy with God. When we are left with no other recourse, when every door seems closed and every prayer seems unheard, it's in those moments that we are forced to turn to God in a way we might not have done before. God knows that our greatest growth comes from a place of desperation, a place where we realize that He alone is our source of strength, our hope, and our salvation. And in those quiet moments when we are stripped of everything else, we begin to hear God's voice more clearly. It's easy to get distracted by the noise of life, the busyness, the demands, the constant movement. But in the silence, we have the space to listen, to hear the still small voice of God guiding us. Sometimes God's voice is not loud and thunderous. It's quiet, gentle, and often only discernible when we have learned to quiet our own hearts and listen. Silence is the perfect environment for hearing from God, and in that silence, we are not alone. God is with us, working in us, preparing us for what lies ahead. If you're in a season of silence right now, I encourage you to embrace it. Don't view it as a sign that God has forgotten you or that He doesn't care. View it as a season of preparation, a time for God to do the deep work that is necessary for the breakthrough you're waiting for. Trust that God's silence is not a denial of your request. It's part of His perfect plan to bring you to a place of spiritual maturity, strength, and readiness for the blessings that are on the way. Wait on the Lord, for He is never far from you. He's simply preparing you for something amazing. As we walk through the silence, it can often feel as though God has abandoned us. We find ourselves questioning, wondering if our prayers are being heard, if our cries for help are falling on deaf ears. But in reality, God's silence does not mean He is absent. It simply means He is at work in ways that we cannot yet see. In fact, the silence is often the space where God is preparing us for what lies ahead, refining us and strengthening our faith in ways we never thought possible. When God is silent, it is not the end of the road. It is just the beginning of something greater. Imagine for a moment the story of the Israelites in the wilderness. They had been enslaved for hundreds of years, and God in His mercy rescued them from the hands of Pharaoh. He led them out of Egypt, through the parted Red Sea, and into the wilderness. But there was one thing that God did not do. He didn't immediately bring them into the promised land. Instead, He led them through the desert, through years of wandering, through moments of hunger, thirst, and desperation. Why? Why didn't God just deliver them into the promised land right away? The wilderness was not just a place of hardship. It was a place of preparation. God knew that His people were not yet ready to receive the blessings He had promised. The journey through the wilderness was necessary for their spiritual growth. It was in the wilderness that God taught them to rely on Him for their daily bread, to trust Him for their protection, and to believe in His power to guide them. He wasn't punishing them by leading them through the desert. He was preparing them for the future He had for them. In the same way, when we face seasons of silence or wilderness experiences, God is not punishing us. He is preparing us. He knows what lies ahead, and He is using the quiet moments, the waiting periods, and even the hardships to shape us into the people we need to be to handle the blessings He is going to pour out. It's often during these times that our character is refined, our dependence on God is strengthened, and our faith is tested. But when we come out of the wilderness, we are stronger, wiser, and better equipped to handle the next chapter of our journey. God's silence is not an indication of His absence. Rather, it is an invitation to trust Him more deeply. In the silence, we are invited to rest in His presence, to lean on Him, and to know that He is at work behind the scenes, even when we can't see it. Our inability to perceive His activity does not diminish its reality. Just as a seed grows beneath the soil, even though we cannot see it, so too is God working in our lives when we feel like nothing is happening. Think about the story of David, who was anointed to be king while he was still a shepherd boy. God had a plan for David's life, but before he could step into the fullness of that plan, he had to go through seasons of waiting, struggle, and silence. For years, David wandered from place to place, facing trials and opposition, even running for his life from King Saul. It must have seemed as though God had forgotten the promise He made to David when he was anointed. And yet those years of silence were crucial for David's development. It was during these years that David learned to depend on God, to trust in His faithfulness, and to develop the character necessary to lead the people of Israel. David's time in the wilderness was not wasted. It was preparation. He had to learn how to be a shepherd before he could be a king. He had to learn humility before he could lead with authority. And he had to learn to trust God's timing, even when it didn't make sense. The silence that David experienced was not the absence of God. It was the training ground where he was being shaped into the man who would one day be called a man after God's own heart. God works in much the same way in our own lives. When we face seasons of silence, when we wonder where God is and why He hasn't yet answered our prayers, we can take comfort in knowing that God is using those moments to prepare us for something greater. The waiting is never in vain. God's silence is a time for us to grow in our faith, to deepen our trust in His promises, and to become more dependent on Him. It's important to note that the silence does not mean that we should stop praying or that God is no longer interested in our lives. On the contrary, it is in these times of silence that we need to press into God even more. Just as a child who is learning to walk may fall many times before they finally stand on their own, so too does our faith grow stronger in the midst of struggle. The key is perseverance, pressing on even when we don't see the immediate fruit of our efforts. God honors our faithfulness, and He is working in us during the times when it feels like nothing is happening. We must also remember that silence is often God's way of refining our motives. When we ask God for something, it's easy to have selfish motives or to want things for our own glory. But God, in His wisdom, uses silence to purify our hearts and to realign our desires with His. He wants to give us good gifts, but He also wants to ensure that we are ready to receive them with the right heart. The silence is not just about waiting for an answer. It's about waiting for our hearts to be ready for that answer. God doesn't just want to bless us. He wants to bless us in a way that brings glory to His name and helps us grow into the people He created us to be. If you are in a season of silence, I encourage you to lean in closer to God. Don't give up, and don't believe the lie that He has abandoned you. Instead, recognize that God is preparing you for something amazing. Just as the Israelites had to go through the wilderness before they could inherit the promised land, you too are being prepared for something greater. The silence is not a sign that God is far from you. It's a sign that He is working in you, shaping you, and molding you into the person He has called you to be. So trust Him, even in the silence, and know that He is with you every step of the way. When we find ourselves in a season of silence, it's important to understand that this is not a time of abandonment or punishment. Instead, it is an opportunity for God to build in us the strength, patience, and wisdom we need to fulfill His plan for our lives. In these moments, we may feel isolated or forgotten, but God is working in the unseen, preparing us for the next step in our journey. It's during these silent times that our faith is truly tested and refined, pushing us to trust God more deeply than ever before. Many of us know what it feels like to be in the middle of a long wait, to pray fervently for something, and yet receive no immediate response. We often hear the comforting assurances from others that a God is working behind the scenes. But in those moments of silence, it can be hard to feel that truth. However, it's crucial to remember that God's silence is not the same as His absence. He is absent. Though we may not hear His voice or see immediate results, He is at work in ways that we may not understand. Our human perspective is limited, but God's view is eternal. What seems like an unanswered prayer or delay in our lives is often part of His greater plan. Take, for example, the story of Joseph in the Bible. As a young man, Joseph had dreams of greatness, dreams in which his brothers would one day bow down to him. Yet after sharing these dreams, he was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and thrown into prison. For years, Joseph endured hardship and seemingly unanswered prayers. During these years, it could have been easy for Joseph to believe that God had forgotten him. After all, where was God when he was thrown into that pit by his brothers? Where was God when he was unjustly thrown into prison? But God was at work during every single moment of Joseph's life. He was preparing him not only for the leadership role he would one day hold, but for a future that would impact the lives of millions. Joseph could not see it at the time, but God was using his suffering to shape him into the leader who would save his family, the nation of Israel, and ultimately the world from famine. The silence that Joseph experienced was not an indication of God's abandonment, but rather a sign that God was molding him for something great. God was working behind the scenes, and when the time was right, Joseph's purpose was revealed in a way that was beyond anything he could have imagined. Joseph's story is a powerful reminder that God uses times of silence to prepare us for what lies ahead. The challenges we face and the unanswered prayers we experience are often part of a larger process that God is using to refine us, strengthen us, and equip us for the future. Just as a blacksmith heats and hammers metal to create a beautiful, strong sword, God uses the trials and silence in our lives to shape us into the people we are meant to be. In the same way, when we go through seasons of silence, we are being shaped and refined by God. We may not always understand why things are happening the way they are, but we can trust that God is in control. He is always working for our good, even when we cannot see it. Just as a potter shapes clay with his hands, God is shaping our hearts, our character, and our faith through the silence. The process may be difficult, but the end result is a person who is more resilient, more trusting, and more capable of fulfilling God's purpose in their life. God's silence also serves as a reminder that His timing is perfect. We live in a world where instant gratification is the norm, and we often expect quick answers to our prayers. But God's timing is not like ours. His timing is always perfect, even when we don't understand it. The Bible tells us in Ecclesiastes 3:11, He has made everything beautiful in its time. While we may be anxious for answers and solutions, God knows the exact moment when He will reveal His plans for us. He is never late, and He is never early. His timing is always right. Think about the story of the Israelites in the wilderness. After God delivered them from slavery in Egypt, they wandered in the desert for 40 years before entering the promised land. This journey was not a mistake. God wasn't punishing them by making them wander in the desert. Rather, He was preparing them for the future. He needed them to learn to rely on him completely, to trust his provision, and to develop the character necessary to inherit the promises he had made. God's timing was perfect, even though it didn't always make sense to them. Similarly, in our own lives, we may feel like we are wandering in the wilderness, waiting for God to answer our prayers or fulfill his promises. But just as the Israelites had to wait for God's timing to bring them into the promised land, we too must trust that God is preparing us for what lies ahead. The silence and waiting are part of his perfect plan, and he will reveal his timing when the moment is right. During these times, it's essential to resist the temptation to take matters into our own hands. We often try to speed up the process or force a solution when we feel that God is silent. But this can lead to more frustration and heartache. Instead, we must learn to rest in God's presence and trust that he is in control. This doesn't mean that we stop praying or seeking God's will. It means that we stop trying to manipulate the situation and allow God to work in his own time and way. There is also a deep sense of peace that comes when we surrender to God's timing. We may not know what the future holds, but we can trust that God is preparing us for it, even in the silence. Just as a farmer trusts the process of planting and waiting for the harvest, we too must trust that God is working behind the scenes, even when we don't seek immediate results. Finally, in times of silence, we are also reminded that God's silence is not an absence of love. In fact, it is often in the silence that we experience the deepest intimacy with God. When we are waiting, when we are desperate for answer, we learn to lean on God in a way that we never could during times of abundance. The silence teaches us to rely on God's presence, not just on his provision. It draws us closer to him and deepens our relationship with him. In the end, silence is not something to fear or resist. It is something to embrace as a time of growth, refinement, and preparation. God is never absent, even when he seems silent. He is always working, always guiding, and always preparing us for the next chapter of our journey. So if you are in a season of silence, know that God is with you, that he is working in you, and that he has a plan for your life. Trust him, even in the silence, and watch as he reveals his purpose for you in his perfect time. When we find ourselves in moments of silence, when God feels distant, we can easily begin to question our worth, our purpose, or even God's love for us. We may start thinking that if God really cared, surely he would be responding to our prayers, meeting our needs, or offering us some kind of sign. However, the truth is that God's silence doesn't mean he's absent or indifferent to our suffering. Instead, it's in these silent moments that God is often doing his most powerful work within us, preparing us for what lies ahead in his divine plan. There's a profound beauty and strength that comes from waiting in the silence, knowing that even when we can't hear God's voice, he is still near and he is still working. In the Bible, we see numerous examples of individuals who experienced long periods of silence before their breakthrough. One of the most striking examples is that of the prophet Elijah. Elijah, mighty man of God, had just witnessed an incredible victory on Mount Carmel, where God demonstrated his power by sending fire from heaven. After this miraculous event, Elijah fled for his life from Queen Jezebel, who sought to kill him. Elijah found himself alone, exhausted and fearful, crying out to God for help. He wanted answers, reassurance, and immediate guidance. But God's response was not what he expected. Instead of a loud, booming voice from heaven, God spoke to Elijah in a still, small voice. 1 Kings 19, 11, 12. This moment of silence and stillness was pivotal in Elijah's life. He needed to hear from God, but God didn't speak in the way Elijah anticipated. He didn't offer immediate solutions or dramatic signs. Instead, he gave Elijah a moment to pause, to listen, and to be still in his presence. In the midst of his exhaustion, fear, and despair, God gently reminded Elijah that he was still in control, that he had a purpose for him, and that there was still more work to be done. It was in that silence that Elijah was restored, renewed, and given new direction. God's silence wasn't a sign of his absence. It was an invitation to trust more deeply, to wait more patiently, and to grow in faith. Just as Elijah experienced a transformative moment in silence, we too can experience spiritual renewal and growth when we embrace God's silence. Often we find ourselves seeking instant answers, quick fixes, or immediate results. We live in a fast-paced world, and our impatience grows when we feel God is silent. Isaiah 55:9 reminds us that God's thoughts are not our thoughts, and His ways are not our ways. He sees the bigger picture, and His plan is always greater than our own. We may not understand the silence now, but in time we will see how God has used it to shape us, to grow us, and to prepare us for what lies ahead. As we embrace God's silence, we are invited to trust Him more deeply, to lean into His presence, and to rest in the knowledge that He is always at work, even when we cannot see it. In the silence, God is not absent. He is preparing us, refining us, and drawing us closer to Him. And when the time is right, He will reveal His purpose and His plan in ways that exceed anything we could have imagined. When you find yourself in a season of silence, it's easy to start wondering, why isn't God answering my prayers? Why does it feel like He's distant, or worse, that He's forgotten me? It's natural to feel this way. We live in a world that moves quickly, and we're often conditioned to expect immediate results and answers. When those answers don't come as quickly as we think they should, we can begin to question God's presence in our lives. But here's something incredibly important to remember. God's silence is not a sign of His absence. On the contrary, it's often in those quiet moments that He is doing His most profound work within us. Think back to the story of Job. Job was a man who experienced unimaginable pain and suffering. He lost his wealth, his health, and his family. Yet in the midst of his agony, the most difficult thing for him to bear was not his physical suffering or the tragic loss of his loved ones. It was God's silence. Job had always known God to be near, a constant presence in his life. But as his trials deepened, God's voice became silent. Job spent days crying out, pleading for answers, for God to intervene. But nothing came. The silence was deafening, and in the absence of God's immediate presence, Job questioned everything he knew about his faith. But as we read further in Job's story, we see that God was not absent during Job's suffering. In fact, God was present in ways that Job couldn't understand at the time. When God finally responded to Job, He did so with a powerful revelation of His sovereignty, wisdom, and purpose. Job was forced to confront the reality that God's ways are not our ways, that God's understanding is far beyond our comprehension, and that He is always at work, even when we can't see it. In Job 38:2, God says to Job, "Who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words?" It wasn't a rebuke, but an invitation for Job to expand his understanding of God's ways. God was not punishing Job with silence. He was preparing him to understand a greater truth. The silence, though painful, was a part of God's divine plan. Job's faith was tested, purified, and ultimately strengthened through the experience. Job had to learn to trust in God's character, even when his circumstances were bleak, even when he couldn't hear God's voice. This experience mirrors what many of us go through in times of silence. We often expect God to answer us in a specific way or on a specific timeline. When He doesn't, we feel rejected, abandoned, or forgotten. But in reality, God's silence is not a sign of neglect. It's an invitation to deeper trust, a call to lean into His sovereignty and to understand that He is at work in ways we may not yet grasp. Sometimes, silence is a powerful tool God uses to help us grow in our faith. If we are constantly bombarded with answers, with immediate relief from our struggles, we may never truly learn to trust God. We may never develop the resilience and patience that come from waiting on Him. The truth is that waiting is an essential part of the Christian journey. It's in the waiting that our faith is refined, and it's in the waiting that we learn to rely more fully on God's timing rather than our own. When God seems silent, we may also find ourselves questioning the promises He has made to us. God has promised to never leave us or forsake us. Deuteronomy 31:6. Yet in the midst of silence, it can feel as if He has abandoned us. But the truth is that God is always with us, even when we can't perceive His presence. Just as the Israelites were never truly abandoned in the wilderness, we too are not abandoned in our seasons of silence. God is with us every step of the way, walking alongside us, teaching us and molding us into the people He created us to be. One of the most profound truths we can hold on to in times of silence is that God's silence is not a punishment. Not a punishment. It's not an indication that we are doing something wrong. In fact, some of the most faithful servants of God have experienced seasons of silence. Moses, for example, spent 40 years in the wilderness before God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. David, too, experienced long periods of silence as he fled from King Saul and endured many trials. But through these silent seasons, both Moses and David grew in their relationship with God. They learned to trust God's leading and timing, and they were ultimately positioned for great purposes. As you walk through your own silent season, it's important to remember that God is not absent. He is present in ways that you might not be able to perceive right now, but He is there working in your life, preparing you for the next chapter of your journey. God's silence is an opportunity for you to grow in trust, to strengthen your faith, and to lean into His presence like never before. In the waiting, you will find that your relationship with God can deepen in ways that you never imagined. There is a peace that comes from trusting God when there are no immediate answers. A peace that can only be found when we surrender to His will and His timing. It's in the silence that we are invited to experience a deeper intimacy with God, to draw closer to Him, and to learn how to rely on His voice and His presence in a more profound way. God is always working even when we can't see it. Just as the seed grows in the soil before it breaks through to the surface, God is working behind the scenes to prepare you for the next step in your journey. The silence is not the absence of God. It's the presence of His perfect timing, His perfect will, and His perfect love. Embrace the silence. Trust that God is with you, and know that when the time is right, He will speak to you, reveal His plans for you, and lead you into the breakthrough you've been waiting for. In the midst of silence, many people find themselves struggling with doubt. It's easy to start believing that because God isn't answering our prayers in the way we expect, that He has either forgotten about us or doesn't care. But this belief could not be further from the truth. In fact, it's in the silence that God often does some of His most powerful work in our lives. It's in the quiet moments that He refines us, strengthens our faith, and teaches us how to trust in His perfect plan. Consider the story of Abraham. Abraham was promised by God that he would become the father of many nations, yet for years, he saw no sign of this promise coming to fruition. His wife Sarah was barren, and they were both well beyond childbearing age. The promise seemed impossible, but even in the silence, when there were no immediate signs that God was working, Abraham continued to trust God. He knew that if God had said it, then God would fulfill it in His perfect timing. And so, after many years of waiting, when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, God fulfilled His promise to them. They had a son, Isaac, and through Isaac, God's covenant with Abraham was passed down through generations. Abraham's faith in God during those years of silence was a testament to the power of trusting God, even when we can't see the end of the journey. Abraham's silence was not a sign that God had abandoned him. It was a part of God's timing. Through that silence, Abraham's faith was deepened, and when the promise was finally fulfilled, it was more glorious than he could have ever imagined. We often forget that silence doesn't mean that God is absent. In fact, silence is often a sign that God is doing something in our hearts, even if we can't perceive it at the moment. The same silence that sometimes leaves us feeling abandoned can also be the place where God is growing us, refining us, and preparing us for what's next. Think about a seed planted in the soil. For a long time, nothing seems to happen. There's no sign of life above the surface. But underneath, the seed is growing, forming roots, and preparing to break through to new life. Similarly, God uses silence to prepare us, to build a deeper foundation of faith, so that when we experience His breakthrough, we're ready to receive it with open hearts and a strong foundation. There's also something incredibly powerful about how silence teaches us patience. In a world where everything is instant communication, instant gratification, instant results, we can become impatient with the waiting process. But God uses silence to teach us how to wait with patience. Patience is not just the ability to wait, it's the ability to wait well, trusting that God is in control and that He is working all things together for our good. The more we learn to wait on God, the more we realize that His timing is always perfect. His delays are not denials. When He seems silent, it's not because He is uninterested in our lives. It's because He is preparing us for something greater. In the silence, we're also given the opportunity to search our hearts. When everything around us seems still, we're forced to look inward and reflect on our lives. We begin to see areas where we need to grow, places where we need healing, and parts of our hearts that need to be surrendered to God. Silence provides a space for introspection, for letting go of distractions, and for deepening our relationship with God. In the quiet, we can hear His voice more clearly, not because He's speaking louder, but because we've stopped trying to fill the silence with our own thoughts and worries. We begin to listen more intently to His whispers. The silence also helps us learn to rely more fully on God. When we're in a season of waiting, and there are no immediate answers, we are forced to rely on God alone. It's in those moments that we realize that He is all we truly need. We can't control the circumstances, we can't force things to happen on our own, but we can trust that God is in control and that He will provide for us in His perfect way and time. This kind of dependence on God builds a stronger faith and a deeper sense of peace. In our waiting, we're also given the opportunity to learn from the examples of others who have gone before us. Scripture is full of stories of men and women who endured long seasons of waiting, and their examples can teach us how to trust God during times of silence. One such example is the Israelites. For 40 years they wandered in the wilderness, waiting for the promise of the promised land. During that time they experienced difficulty, doubt, and frustration. But God used those years to mold them into a people who would be ready to receive the promise He had for them. As we wait in the silence, we can look to the stories of those who have gone before us, trusting that just as God was faithful to them, He will be faithful to us as well. And in those moments of waiting, we can also take comfort in knowing that we are not alone. God is with us even when we can't see or hear Him. He has not forgotten us, even when it feels like He has. The silence is part of His plan, part of the process of refining us and preparing us for what's to come. The silence can also be an invitation to surrender. Another important aspect of God's silence is that it teaches us to trust His timing. We live in a world where everything is fast-paced, and we often expect instant results. We want answers right away, and when God doesn't give us the answers we're seeking, we can become frustrated or discouraged. But God's timing is perfect, and His ways are higher than ours. He sees the bigger picture, and He knows exactly when the right moment is for His plans to unfold. His silence is often a reminder that He is in control, and we can trust Him to act at the right time. Think about the story of Jesus and His disciples in the boat during a storm. While they were battling the storm, Jesus was asleep in the boat. The disciples were afraid, and they woke Him up, asking why He wasn't doing anything to help them. But Jesus responded by calming the storm and asking them, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" In that moment, the disciples learned a powerful lesson about trusting Jesus in the midst of the storm. Even when it felt like He was silent, He was still with them, and He was still in control. Sometimes in the silence, we are learning to trust that God is in the boat with us, even if we can't feel His presence or see His hand at work. As we reflect on the lessons God teaches us in silence, it's also important to remember that silence is not permanent. Just as seasons change, so too will the season of silence we may find ourselves in. God is always moving, always working, and His silence is never an indication that He has abandoned us. There will come a time when the silence will be broken, when God will reveal His plans, and when we will see the fruit of our waiting. But in the meantime, we are called to trust, to wait with expectation, and to keep our hearts open to what God is doing in the silence. And when that silence is broken, when we see the answers to our prayers and the fulfillment of God's promises, we will realize that the waiting was not in vain. God's timing will be perfect, and the breakthrough will be more glorious than we could have ever imagined. The lessons we learned in the silence will prepare us to fully appreciate the blessings that come with God's answer. We will have a deeper sense of gratitude, a stronger faith, and a more intimate relationship with God, because we trusted Him in the silence. So if you find yourself in a season of waiting, in a time of silence, don't despair. Don't give up. Trust that God is at work in your life, even if you can't see it right now. Use this time to grow in faith, to learn to depend on Him more fully, and to reflect on what He might be teaching you. God has not forgotten you. He is with you, working in ways you can't yet see. And in His perfect timing, He will reveal His plans for you. Keep trusting, keep praying, and keep believing that the silence is not the end of the story. It's just the beginning of something even greater that God has in store for you.